My son didn't just reach for my money. He reached for the arm I used to build the house he wanted to steal. The crack sounded like a dry twig, and for a second I thought it came from the old crown molding I'd salvaged during the renovation. Then the floor tilted and I realized it was me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I'm an old contractor from Charleston, and I sold the big East Bay mansion because a quiet life costs less than echoing rooms and ghosts. The closing statement said $1,287,500. After fees and taxes, my net was $912,430, enough to buy a modest place and set up a careful retirement. That number was my plan, not his. Ethan let himself in like the deed still had his childhood scribbled on it. He picked up the manila folder from the kitchen island and thumbed through the papers the way a gambler fans cards. "Half," he said. "Now." He'd never worked a season on that house. He was away at college when I carried lumber in the rain and tore out the termite nests, but entitlement makes its own arithmetic. I told him the money was for my care. Property tax prepayments, a small cottage near the water, a cushion for the years ahead. He smirked like I'd told a joke with no punchline. The fight wasn't cinematic. It was petty. He called me selfish. I told him no. He stepped closer, his eyes on the envelope from the bank. High-yield account information, new routing number, wire limits. And when I put my hand over it, he grabbed my wrist and twisted. Pain is bright at my age. It flooded my vision, my breath. The folder slid, papers fanned, and I went to the tile knees first, cheek against grout I'd laid myself. He stood there, chest heaving, then hissed, "Sign something," as if forms were just impatient wishes. Our neighbor Claire heard the fall. She keeps a nurse's kit under her sink. I know because she came through the door with it, and the steadiness of someone who's seen worse. Ethan backed to the hallway, swallowed and left. No slam, just a retreat, the way a person exits a room they think they still own. Claire pressed 2 fingers to my pulse and said the word I didn't want to hear. Fracture. She called an ambulance and while we waited, helped me gather the papers off the floor. She saw the totals, the bank letter, the neat black ink. "Keep this together," she whispered. "Start a record." At the hospital, I studied the X-ray the way I used to study blueprints, lines too clean to be anything but broken. The doctor said ulnar and clean break. He fitted a temporary brace and printed my discharge. I asked the clerk for a duplicate copy. She stapled it to my ID photocopy without rolling her eyes, which I appreciated more than she'll ever know. In the ambulance ride back, I balanced the folder on my lap like a borrowed child. Ethan wanted a signature. What he gave me was motive. That night, I placed the folder on the kitchen table and wrote 3 words on a yellow sticky note. "Keep it official." I photographed the swelling. I dictated a voice memo with names and the exact phrase he used, "Half now." Then I set the manila folder upright like a book on a stand. I used to think revenge was a shout. It turns out it begins with a file, one you refuse to let anyone else write. The emergency room lights always hum louder when you're the one beneath them. I remember the fluorescent buzz, the antiseptic sting, and the soft shuffle of nurses switching shifts. The X-ray on the screen showed my left arm like a cracked branch, clear, deliberate, final. The doctor said ulnar fracture and 6 to 8 weeks. I nodded like I was agreeing to a weather report. Claire stayed by my side, still in her slippers, her hair pulled back like she'd sprinted straight from her kitchen. She handed me a small bag with my wallet, phone, and the folder, the same one I wouldn't let Ethan touch. Inside, the ER clerk had stapled my discharge summary to a photocopy of my ID. I slid it behind the bank's closing statement and thought, this is the first real proof. Back home, the silence didn't sound peaceful anymore, it sounded staged. Every creak, every draft in that oversized house felt like a reminder that I'd built my own prison out of hardwood and pride. I couldn't lie down, so I sat upright on the couch with my arm elevated and the manila folder balanced on my lap. I opened my phone and scrolled through Ethan's old texts. His "love you dad" messages followed months later by "need an advance," then "when can I access my share?" It wasn't a timeline anymore, it was evidence. At 2:17 a.m., I recorded a voice memo. My own voice sounded strange, detached, like I was narrating a case file. I listed everything: the time of the fight, the bruise on my wrist, the exact words, half now. Then I added a note to myself: don't delete this. Don't forgive too soon. When morning came, I brewed coffee with one hand and walked room to room collecting anything tied to Ethan. A spare key under the planter, the framed photo of us by the dock, a checkbook he'd once borrowed for emergencies. The missing check stubs made my chest tighten. I changed the garage keypad code and placed the remaining keys in a ceramic bowl on the counter. One was gone. I didn't need a detective to know who had it. Claire knocked mid-morning with muffins and advice. "File a report," she said. "If you don't, he'll rewrite the story." Her words hung heavier than the cast, so I did. I called the non-emergency police line, gave them my statement, and wrote down the case number on a sticky note. When I stuck it to the folder, it looked like a small yellow flag marking a battlefield. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how fast love turns to leverage. I stared at the ceiling until the ache in my arm blurred into something colder. Ethan had taken my strength for granted once. He wouldn't take my safety next. Tomorrow, I'd start turning my pain into paper. And this time, every word would count. The emergency room lights always hum louder when you're the one beneath them. I remember the fluorescent buzz, the antiseptic sting, and the soft shuffle of nurses switching shifts. The X-ray on the screen showed my left arm like a cracked branch, clear, deliberate, final. The doctor said ulnar fracture and 6 to 8 weeks. I nodded like I was agreeing to a weather report. Claire stayed by my side, still in her slippers, her hair pulled back like she'd sprinted straight from her kitchen. She handed me a small bag with my wallet, phone, and the folder, the same one I wouldn't let Ethan touch. Inside, the ER clerk had stapled my discharge summary to a photocopy of my ID. I slid it behind the bank's closing statement and thought, this is the first real proof. Back home, the silence didn't sound peaceful anymore. It sounded staged. Every creak, every draft in that oversized house felt like a reminder that I'd built my own prison out of hardwood and pride. I couldn't lie down, so I sat upright on the couch with my arm elevated and the manila folder balanced on my lap. I opened my phone and scrolled through Ethan's old texts. His "love you dad" messages followed months later by "need an advance," then "when can I access my share?" It wasn't a timeline anymore, it was evidence. At 2:17 a.m., I recorded a voice memo. My own voice sounded strange, detached, like I was narrating a case file. I listed everything: the time of the fight, the bruise on my wrist, the exact words, half now. Then I added a note to myself: don't delete this. Don't forgive too soon. When morning came, I brewed coffee with one hand and walked room to room collecting anything tied to Ethan. A spare key under the planter, the framed photo of us by the dock, a checkbook he'd once borrowed for emergencies. The missing check stubs made my chest tighten. I changed the garage keypad code and placed the remaining keys in a ceramic bowl on the counter. One was gone. I didn't need a detective to know who had it. Claire knocked mid-morning with muffins and advice. "File a report," she said. "If you don't, he'll rewrite the story." Her words hung heavier than the cast, so I did. I called the non-emergency police line, gave them my statement, and wrote down the case number on a sticky note. When I stuck it to the folder, it looked like a small yellow flag marking a battlefield. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how fast love turns to leverage. I stared at the ceiling until the ache in my arm blurred into something colder. Ethan had taken my strength for granted once. He wouldn't take my safety next. Tomorrow, I'd start turning my pain into paper. And this time, every word would count. He thought intimidation would look like muscle. I decided intimidation would look like paperwork. The first rule I learned from Carter was simple: make every move traceable. If Ethan wanted my money, he'd have to walk through a paper trail that led straight back to him. If he tried to blur the edges with a notary or a slick phone call, I would sharpen those edges until they cut. So I began with receipts. That morning I drove, slow, careful, with the folder on the passenger seat like a passenger with a bad hip. I handed Carter copies. The closing statement showing $1,187,500, the escrow disbursement slip listing $912,130, my ER discharge summary, and the police case number written on adhesive tape. He made a chronology and told me to keep everything in the order he numbered. "Chronology is a prosecutor's favorite toy," he said, tapping the stack with his pen. He drafted a demand to cease letter and told me we'd send it certified mail. The green receipt card would be important, proof the letter arrived, and the date stamp would be impossible to fake. Carter called Jessa and told her to start digging. She called back within 4 hours with a map that read like an ugly biography. Phone numbers, collection agencies, default notices. Ethan owed $34,600 to a car flipper in Mount Pleasant, a string of payday loans to a firm in North Charleston, and he'd tapped an online investment service that looked more like a predatory circle. "When people owe that much, they stop asking nicely," Jessa said. "They borrow from predators who make promises and then press for collateral. That's probably who sent the text." I let her map the debt trail and instructed her to follow the breadcrumbs to lenders and notaries, anyone who'd been handy with a pen when Ethan wanted a shortcut. At the bank, Marisol Ruiz moved like someone who had seen too many family fights turn into fraud files. She printed an internal memo that said, "Account moved to a high-yield hold, wire transfers disabled for 30 days, and any request for POA would require in-person notarized verification and attorney confirmation." She gave me a stamped copy dated that morning and logged the account alert in the system. "If anyone calls pretending to be you," she said, "we'll ask for a voice print and a notarized statement." I made her repeat the exact phrase so I could write it down. That little redundancy felt like armor. Jessa's next call had more teeth. She checked a notary journal at a small shop outside town and found an entry. My name misspelled, a signature that didn't match, the same journal that the unknown notary used. She sent a photo of the journal page with the odd signature and the adjacent day's entries showing a rush of notarizations from the same phone prefix that matched the burner number that sent me the threat. She'd even found a payroll stub for a man who worked part-time at a mobile notary service. His hours lined up with the time frame Ethan had been at my house the week the sale closed. "They're sloppy," she said. "Sloppy people leave fingerprints." Back home, Claire came by with a thumb drive. "I grabbed the doorbell footage," she said, as if it were nothing. She'd been out in her garden, she told me, and the camera had caught Ethan on the porch the afternoon he left the yellow envelope. The video showed him lingering, 2 minutes, head down, then slipping the envelope under the mat and walking away. Claire had frozen stills and timestamps and had burned the copy onto the drive. We copied it straight into the folder and labeled it porch drop, yellow envelope, photo stills. Jessa later confirmed the envelope contained a typed agreement demanding $400,000 and with no legal letterhead or signature, just a demand dressed as a negotiation. Every piece we gathered became a notch. The certified mail green card, the bank memo, the notary journal photo, the doorbell stills, Jessa's debt ledger. I logged each item in a small notebook I kept by the folder. Item, date, I found it, where it was in the binder. That ledger read like a recipe for accountability. I also began to bait in ways that felt surgical and lawful. Under Carter's direction, I wrote one short message to Ethan. "If you want to talk about the house proceeds, put your proposal in writing and send it to my attorney. No other contact." He replied with a voicemail, angry, then pleading, saying, "Dad, I'm sorry, I just need help now." Carter told me to forward it to his office. We transcribed it and placed the transcript in the binder. Then, on Jessa's advice, I did something I never thought I'd do. I let Ethan stumble. I made sure every interaction, phone, text, voicemail, went through a channel an attorney could subpoena. The predators didn't like waiting. At 3:09 p.m., Marisol emailed me a bank call log showing an attempted phone inquiry from a number that matched the notary's prefix. The caller asked about acceptable forms for release and used a near miss on my last name, one letter different. The bank flagged it and attached the recording. I played it with Carter. The caller's tone was casual, too practiced for living in Charleston. Carter marked the file. "We'll include this in a motion," he said. Meanwhile, Jessa found a small pattern that made my blood run cold. A man with links to that mortgage side lender had been to a title office and asked about fast transfers in the same week Ethan visited the house. He'd signed as consultant. The signatures didn't match the man in the video, but the footprints overlapped. It was enough to connect the text threats to a network, and a network was easier to box in than a desperate son. By the end of the week, the folder felt heavier than it had the day the paper first arrived. It wasn't weight from the documents alone. It was the weight of the plan. Each file was a fence post that kept the ground from giving way. I wasn't acting out of vengeance in the petty sense. I was building a line nobody could cross legally. That Saturday, after Carter filed a formal notice of intent to the bank and served a certified copy to Ethan's last known address, I sat in the kitchen and opened the soup Claire had left. My left arm throbbed when I lifted the spoon, but the pain was clearer now. Less panic, more purpose. I put the spoon down and wrote a single line in my ledger: "Paperwork wins where fists fail." It felt like a good first newspaper headline for a life I was determined to keep. Every revenge story, if told truthfully, has a moment when you could still walk away. For me, that moment came the morning the sheriff's office left a voicemail asking if I wanted to press charges. I stared at the blinking light on the landline, thumb hovering over the button, and realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Anger burns fast. Purpose keeps the coals hot. I met Carter at his office that afternoon, my arm wrapped tight in a brace, the manila folder thicker than ever. He had already filed for a temporary protective order, and the judge had signed an interim notice forbidding Ethan from contacting me except through legal counsel. It wasn't final yet, but it drew a line in the sand. Carter smiled without warmth. "Now," he said, "we make sure he trips over it." That same day, Jessa served the documents at a car detailing shop where Ethan worked part-time. Her report described him laughing and performing for friends before the color drained from his face as he saw the seal on the envelope. A minute later, a friend filmed him waving the papers around like a trophy. Jessa attached the screenshot to her report and emailed it to Carter. Time-stamped, geotagged, indisputable. By evening, the predators made their next move. I received another text, this time from a different number. "Our client needs resolution by Monday. Help your son avoid bigger problems." The phrasing was loyally deliberate. Not a loan shark this time, a fixer. I forwarded it to Carter. He read it twice and said, "They're bluffing, but bluffers tend to double down before folding. Marisol at the bank called next." She sounded tense. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "we logged another attempt at wire access. This time, someone called asking to update contact verification. The caller used your date of birth correctly but couldn't answer the security phrase. She faxed me the printed call log, complete with timestamp and operator initials. I added it to the binder under attempts, phone access. That night, I replaced the front deadbolt again, not because I needed to, but because rituals help when you're waiting. Claire printed stills from her doorbell footage, Ethan's shadow under the porch light, and handed me a set in a clear sleeve. "Keep them," she said. "Paper beats memory." She stayed while I filed them in order. She noticed the line I'd written on a sticky note over the folder spine: "Paperwork wins where fists fail." She smiled faintly. "Make it your motto." The following morning, Carter called. "We're ready for hearing prep," he said. Mid-December. He wanted every item catalogued, each receipt, text, and memo labeled with its source. I spent the day turning my dining room into a caseboard. Post-it notes, arrows, ledger lines connecting the text messages to the notary's fake journal. The bank call logs to Ethan's debt map. Late that evening, I allowed myself one conversation with Ethan. On speakerphone, recorder on, Carter listening silently from the other line. He started with charm. "Dad, let's not make this ugly. We're family. His voice cracked halfway through. "If you'd just signed the power paper, we'd be square by Monday." That phrase, power paper, froze Carter in place. He mouthed the words, "Thank you." It was all the confirmation we needed, not a legitimate document, but a slang term the lender's fixer had probably used to convince him everything was legal. I hung up, pressed save, and titled the recording Power Paper Call. It was the most useful confession he'd ever made. After that night, my fear started fading. The house still creaked, but now every sound was part of the record. A door hinge squeak logged under maintenance, a lock click under security. I had built my evidence the same way I'd once built homes, foundation first. Frame tight, corners squared, only this time I wasn't constructing something to live in. I was building something that could stand in court. The next step was simple. If Ethan wanted to test my boundaries, I'd let the courtroom measure them for him. And once the gavel fell, I'd make sure the lesson echoed louder than any broken bone ever could. 2 days before the hearing, the small things began to line up like teeth in a trap. Jessa called in the morning, and her voice had that calm edge that meant she'd found something useful. "Come look," she said. She'd gone to a tiny mobile notary's office off Rivers Avenue, one of those places that notarize car titles and small claims affidavits, and pulled the notary journal. There, tucked between a pile of routine signatures, was an entry with my name spelled wrong and a hurried scrawl beside it. The signature didn't match any I'd ever seen. Jessa photographed it, circled the oddities, and emailed the image with the subject line, "Notary Journal. Possible forgery." I printed the photo and slid it into the binder next to the certified mail receipt. Carter read the page, slow and methodical. "This is the kind of sloppy thread a forger leaves," he said. "Not everyone knows how to mimic a signature. They mimic the angle, the pressure, then they rush." He told me to expect pushback, denial, maybe even a claim that the signature was mine and I'd signed something in a confusion of generosity. "We'll let the handwriting experts decide," he said. "But first, we make the hellhole of paperwork they crawled through visible." That afternoon, Marisol at First Palmetto Bank called with news that sounded like a warning. "Someone tried to schedule a wire out of the account," she said. "They used an email address that swapped an N for an M in your last name, and they tried to bypass verification with an urgency pitch. The two-factor authentication blocked it." She emailed the call log, the attempted wire form with the typo, and a printout showing the block. I put the paper beside the notary photo. The pattern was now a line: notary entry, email typo, attempted wire, burner phone threats. Whoever was orchestrating this had a playbook. They were sloppy enough to leave fingerprints, and we would press them into evidence. That evening, a voicemail arrived from Ethan. I played it through Carter's office speakers. He sounded smaller than his texts, voice low. "Dad, I'm sorry about the other night. I lost it. I'm trying to fix things. Can we talk, please? Off the record?" He begged in a way that made my chest ache in old, complicated ways. "Off the record is where people try to bury evidence." I forwarded the voicemail to Carter and Jessa and asked for a transcript. Carter typed the words into a brief and stamped it filed. The transcription went into the binder as Exhibit G, then the twist tightened. Jessa found a payroll stub linking a man named Daniel Reyes, listed as a mobile consultant, to a title company 2 counties over. Daniel's hours matched the exact day someone had tried to notarize a document at the Rivers Avenue shop. The name matched a registration for a vehicle seen in Claire's porch camera footage the week the yellow envelope appeared. When Jessa ran Daniel's phone number through a search, she found it tied to a small network of fixers who advertised quick closings and expedited legal help to folks who didn't want a lawyer involved. One of the listings used phrasing almost identical to the text I'd received: "We'll make the paperwork easy." No questions asked. By the time Carter drafted the subpoena for the notary's full journal and the title company's visitor logs, the story we were carrying into court had become less about a desperate son and more about a small enterprise built around stolen opportunities. In the middle of the night, I reread the folder. Closing statement, escrow slip, ER discharge, police report, bank freeze letter, notary photo, attempted wire printout, voicemail transcript, payroll stub, and Claire's doorbell stills. Each document bolstered the one beside it. The ledger I kept, itemized and dated, looked like a map leading directly to the people who'd tried to take my money. On the morning the subpoena was served, Jessa reported back. The notary's demeanor shifted the second she mentioned the court. He stammered, then said he'd misplaced a few pages and that his journal might be incomplete. People who lie forget details. The missing pages became an opportunity. Carter filed a motion to compel and requested a handwriting analyst to examine the disputed entry. He also prepared an emergency notice to the judge, asking for the bank freeze to remain in place until the court could review the notary's records. When he left the courthouse, his face had that look lawyers get, part fatigue, part small, fierce satisfaction. A day later, the bank emailed an attachment that made me feel something like vindication. Attached was a screen capture of an attempted login from an IP in a neighboring county and the two-factor denial time-stamped within minutes of the notary's suspicious entry. Marisol's note read, "We will not authorize any wire without in-person verification and counsel sign-off." She added her initials and the branch stamp. Carter circled the bank stamp and wrote, "Preserve." I did. The final piece that swung the twist into a slam came from a source I hadn't expected, the title office. A clerk there, uncomfortable with the way the consultant had asked questions about fast transfers, had quietly kept a copy of a printed email asking about expedited settlement options. The clerk handed it to Jessa when she came to ask questions, on the condition that her name not appear in open court. The email used the same near misspelling on my last name and included a link to a scanned agreement that matched the $400,000 demand in the yellow envelope. The handwriting sample on that scanned agreement didn't match mine. When Carter assembled these pieces for the pre-hearing file, the room felt smaller, not in a bad way, but like all the air had been pushed toward clarity. We weren't going into court with grief and accusation. We were going in with a chain of documents that said plainly, someone tried to take my money and left a breadcrumb trail back to them. That night, I placed the notary photo under a paperweight and wrote one long line across the top of my ledger. They left too many prints. I slept harder than I had since the night the bone cracked. The twist wasn't that I'd been betrayed by my son alone. The twist was that he'd leaned on a small machinery of shortcuts and lying expertise, and that machinery had its own fingerprints. The set piece was no longer imagined. It was inevitable. The courtroom in Charleston's county courthouse smelled of pine oil and paperwork. I'd spent a lifetime building homes from foundation to finish, but that morning, walking in with my arm in a brace, I realized I was about to build something different, a wall of proof. One page at a time. Carter's voice was low, steady. "Remember," he said, "we don't win with emotion. We win with order." He carried 2 binders, each labeled with my name in block letters. Mine thicker sat on the table between us. I had added tabs with neat labels, bank freeze, hospital, doorbell footage, voicemails, attempted wire logs. Every document I'd collected was a beam in the structure we were about to raise. The judge, a woman with grey hair coiled tight at her neck, looked over her glasses and said, "Let's proceed." Ethan sat on the opposite side of the aisle in a suit that didn't quite fit, sleeves brushing his knuckles. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen him without anger in his eyes. "Maybe at his mother's funeral," Carter began. "Your Honor, this is a case of attempted financial exploitation. A son's effort to seize the proceeds from his father's home sale through coercion and forgery." He gestured to me. "Mr. Reynolds sold his property for $1,987,500, received $912,430 after fees, and moved the funds to a restricted account. Within a week, his son demanded half now, assaulted him, and initiated fraudulent efforts to access those funds." He placed the closing statement on the evidence cart. Then the escrow slip, the ER discharge summary, and finally, the printed transcript of Ethan's voicemail. If you'd just sign the power paper, we'd be square by Monday. The courtroom went still. Ruiz from First Palmetto took the stand first. She explained how the bank froze the account after multiple suspicious calls, one using a near-identical email, another attempting to bypass two-factor verification. She read from the call log aloud, her voice calm as she named the exact minute and second each call came in. These attempts, she said, were blocked, but they show deliberate coordination. Next came Jessa, the private investigator. She carried a thick folder that looked like it could sink a ship. She described the forged notary entry, the payroll stub linking Daniel Reyes to the predatory lender, and the matching phone prefix across the texts, burner number, and call logs. Then she produced a still image from Claire's doorbell footage, showing Ethan on the porch at 3:47 p.m., slipping the yellow envelope under the mat. Inside, she said, holding up the document in a protective sleeve, was a demand for $400,000, unsigned, typed on unmarked paper. The judge leaned forward. Did Mr. Reynolds sign any authorization to distribute these funds? None, Jessa answered. We verified through both bank records and handwriting analysis, Claire testified last. She told them about the crash, the ambulance, the bruises on my wrist, and the way Ethan had stood there before walking out the door. Her voice didn't tremble. She pointed to the photos of my arm in the brace and the still from her doorbell video. I just want the truth to stay where it belongs, she said quietly. Carter's final exhibit was the notary's own journal, subpoenaed after Jessa's visit. The page with my forged signature sat enlarged on the courtroom projector. The analyst explained the slant, the inconsistent pressure, the missing loop in the letter Y. This is not the same writer, she said. Not even close. When Carter finished, he closed the binder and stepped back. Your Honor, we've shown motive, opportunity, and attempted execution of financial fraud. This isn't about inheritance. It's about protection, and a man's right to keep what he earned. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to Ethan. Do you wish to respond? He stood, tugged at his sleeves, and said, I panicked. I thought he'd cut me out of everything. I never meant to hurt him. His eyes darted toward me, searching for sympathy I didn't have left to give. Carter remained silent until the judge asked, Mr. Reynolds, anything you'd like to add? I stood carefully, bracing my arm against the table. Your Honor, I said, I built that house nail by nail. I raised my son in it. I didn't sell it to punish him. I sold it because I wanted peace. And he broke my arm trying to take what wasn't his. I'm not here to ruin him. I just want my peace back. For a moment, nobody moved. The judge wrote something, then looked up. I'll review all evidence and issue a ruling by Friday. Until then, all current orders remain in place. As the gavel struck, the sound was sharp and final, like a bone snapping clean. Ethan turned once at the door, mouth open, but words failed him. I didn't need to hear an apology. I had one waiting on paper, signed by time and proof. When we stepped outside, the courthouse steps were warm under the sun. Carter exhaled through his nose and said, That's how you build a case, Mr. Reynolds, brick by brick. And for the first time since the night of the fight, I believed him. The house I'd built was gone, but the foundation, truth, order, record, was still standing. Unshakable handoff. The verdict would come soon, but I already knew which side of the wall I stood on. Friday came, like a verdict, wrapped in winter light. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee with one hand, and sat at the kitchen table waiting for Carter's call. The phone buzzed at 9:12 a.m., and his voice came through steady, practiced, almost kind. It's done, he said. The ruling's in your favor. I didn't breathe for a full second. Then he read it aloud. The temporary restraining order was now permanent for 2 years. The court confirmed financial exploitation had been attempted and ordered the freeze on my account to remain while authorizing me to open a small stipend account for monthly living expenses. Ethan's conduct had been referred to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential forgery and fraud. I listened, pen in hand, writing it all down, even though I knew Carter had already emailed the ruling. Habit dies slow when your peace once lived in documentation. When I finally opened the court's PDF, I saw the seal at the bottom, gold against grey ink, and something unclenched in my chest. Justice doesn't come as music. It comes as a stamped signature and a docket number that finally tells you the nightmare has paperwork. Carter had already filed a civil claim for damages, medical costs, attorney fees, PI expenses, but he reminded me it wasn't about money anymore. "It's about acknowledgement," he said. "The paper says he did it. That's what matters." The same day, Jessa called with an update. "The burner numbers are dead," she said. The lender's fixer went quiet. "And our notary friend?" "He's talking," offered a full statement in exchange for leniency. I asked what that meant. "It means your son wasn't working alone," she said, "but he's the one who opened the door. Claire brought dinner that evening." She didn't ask about the hearing. She just set the casserole down and poured tea. "So," she said. I slid the printed ruling across the table. She read in silence, nodding, her nurse's instinct scanning it like a chart. "Good," she said finally. "That's one kind of healing. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. No creaks, no imagined footsteps, no doorbell echoes. Just quiet. Over the next week, the ripples started showing. The county clerk's office called to confirm my notarized testimony for the prosecutor. The bank reinstated my account with a new number and a fraud alert permanently attached. A deputy dropped off a contact card, a small, polite rectangle reminding me that the restraining order was active and enforceable. The world began to look ordinary again, which felt miraculous. Ethan, I learned through Jessa, had left Charleston for a few days. His friends had started unfollowing him on social media after seeing local coverage of the hearing summary. The same friends who used to film him laughing at the detailing shop now avoided him. One post showed his old Mustang for sale, captioned, "Need cash, quick." The next afternoon, I visited the bank to set up my stipend account. Marisol greeted me with her usual professionalism, but a softer smile. "I read the ruling," she said. "We don't often see them go right." She handed me a new debit card, embossed name, clean and correct. "If he ever calls again, we'll record it before he finishes his sentence." I thanked her and slid the card into my wallet beside the photo of my late wife. A photo I hadn't looked at much lately because grief and betrayal share a similar weight. At home, I sat at the smaller kitchen table, the one I'd bought after selling the mansion, and wrote a check to Claire for the nurse supplies she'd used that first night. She tried to refuse it. I told her, "You didn't just save my arm, you saved the evidence." She laughed and tore the check in half, saying, "Consider it pro bono justice." That night, I took off the brace for good. My left arm was stiff but whole. I flexed my fingers and stared at the faint scar line like it was punctuation on the end of a long sentence. Then I did what I always do when I'm ready to let a phase of my life settle. I opened my notebook and wrote the closing line for the day. Peace doesn't announce itself. It just starts showing up on your doorstep, where fear used to live. The court hadn't given me back my house, or my youth, or my son, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. A boundary no one could cross again. Carter once told me that justice doesn't shout, it signs, seals, and files. When the civil settlement papers arrived by courier in a stiff envelope marked confidential, the sound of the tear across the seal felt louder than any verdict could. Inside were 3 documents, a consent order, a reimbursement schedule, and an apology clause that Carter had insisted remain handwritten. The order was simple. Ethan admitted to attempted financial interference, agreed to no contact for 2 years, and consented to reimburse $8,000 for legal retainers and $200 for security upgrades, locks, cameras, new keypad. He also signed a clause declaring that I held exclusive ownership of all proceeds from the mansion sale. No lawyer would ever call that emotional closure, but it was accountability on paper. And paper lasts longer than feelings. I read his signature at the bottom, stiff, uneven, the E crooked as if even his hand had lost confidence. There was no letter, no note, no "I'm sorry," But the apology clause was enough. The defendant acknowledges the pain and financial distress caused to his father. It's strange how seeing the words "his father" in legal ink made something inside me settle. Carter called to confirm the consent order had been filed with the clerk. "You can move your funds now," he said. "But I recommend you take my earlier advice. Set up that trust we talked about." So I did. The next morning, Marisol helped me ladder the $912,430 into treasury bills and a small retirement trust, paying me a monthly stipend that no one but me could touch. When she printed the new summary sheet and handed it over, she smiled. "That's safety with interest," she said. With each transfer, I felt the last threads of panic unwind. I cancelled credit lines Ethan had once known about and filed every closure notice neatly in my binder. I didn't shred the folder that had started this whole battle. I stored it in a fireproof box. I told Claire it's not evidence anymore. It's a monument. She smiled and said, "Then light no candles, just keep the receipts." Weeks passed. December turned quiet. The courthouse decorated for the holidays, wreaths hanging beside the same doors where I'd once walked in trembling. I stopped by Carter's office with a small gift, a bottle of bourbon and a note that said, "For when your next client forgets what peace feels like." He laughed, said I'd done everything right, and handed me the final court-stamped consent decree. "Frame it if you want," he joked. That night I read it one last time before locking it away. Case closed. Parties in agreement. Funds secured. Simple words, but they felt like oxygen. Justice doesn't always look like a man behind bars. Sometimes it looks like a steady bank balance, a healed arm, and a front door that locks from the inside without fear. I hadn't gained anything new, really. I just kept what was mine. And that, I realized, is what most victories look like when you're too old for revenge, but still young enough for boundaries. When I finally turned off the light, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I used to think betrayal came like thunder, loud, quick, final. But it doesn't. It creeps in quietly, disguised as family, then lingers in the walls long after the shouting stops. After the court dates ended and the lawyers folded their files, the silence in my house changed again. It wasn't the echo of fear anymore. It was peace, steady and dull, like the hum of air refrigerator at midnight, proof of life continuing. Each morning, I brewed coffee in the same chipped mug from the mansion's kitchen. I'd bought it 30 years ago at a yard sale with my wife. The handle had a tiny crack, just big enough to remind me that some brakes don't need fixing to keep holding. My arm had healed by then, stiff on cold mornings, but I could grip that mug without pain. The scar on my forearm had faded to a pale line. The doctor said I could start light carpentry again, but I didn't. I'd spent too many years building things that could be taken away. Now I wanted to build habits, slower, quieter ones. Sometimes Claire stopped by with groceries or just to talk. She had that way of bringing warmth into a room without trying. Once she caught me staring at the folder, still neatly labeled and stored in the cabinet. "You keeping it forever?" she asked. "Not forever," I said. "Just long enough to remember what boundaries look like on paper." She smiled and said, "You learned something then." I walked along the Battery again for the first time in months. The tide rolled against the old stones, the air crisp with salt. Charleston felt smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because my world had. And I liked it that way. A smaller world is easier to protect. Back home, I cleaned the kitchen and put away every document I didn't need daily. For years, I'd built my identity around what I owned. The mansion, the trucks, the contracts, the trophies from jobs that paid well. But sitting in that quiet room, surrounded by just the essentials, I realized that safety isn't made of things. It's made of limits. And I finally had some. One evening, I opened the photo album I hadn't touched since my wife's passing. There was Ethan at 10, holding a hammer too big for his hands, grinning like the world owed him nothing. I touched the photo's edge and whispered, "I wish I'd taught you that keeping what's yours doesn't mean taking what isn't." Then I closed the album and slid it back on the shelf. Some lessons arrived too late for one generation, but right on time for the next. That night I sat by the window with the lamp off, watching the streetlights glow. My reflection stared back faintly in the glass. Older, yes, but not defeated. I said it out loud, maybe to the dark, maybe to myself. Peace doesn't come when people stop hurting you. It comes when they no longer can. I wrote those words in my notebook, right below the last line from the court hearing. Then I added another note beneath it. My house is small. My heart is smaller, and that's enough. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the dark fill the room like forgiveness that no one needed to earn. A week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox without a return address. Inside was a glossy postcard from a luxury car dealership in Atlanta, all chrome reflections and sunshine over a sports coupe. In the corner, printed in clean black type, was Ethan's name. They must have scraped it from some old mailing list. I laughed once, sharp and short, and then I slipped the card into the manila folder that had started this whole war. It didn't hurt to hold it anymore. It just felt like punctuation. That evening I brewed coffee, black and quiet. The house hummed in its small rhythm, the tick of the wall clock, the sigh of pipes, the ocean air sliding in through the cracked window. The world had gone on, and so had I. I set my phone on the table, opened the voice recorder and said, "Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from." My own voice made me smile. It felt right to end the story where so many of mine had begun, with a confession. I spoke slowly, like a man reading his own eulogy, but smiling through it. My son broke my arm when I refused to give him the money from selling my mansion, I said. But what he really broke was the idea that love means surrender. I paused, letting the silence settle around the words. "You didn't lose me, son," I whispered. "You gave me away." Then I leaned back in my chair, looked at the scar on my arm, and thought of all the things that had survived the break: truth, patience, and one good neighbor who believed me when no one else did. The folder sat on the shelf beside the coffee tin, its edges worn, its contents sealed. Ledger balanced, locks changed, receipts kept, justice served. And somewhere in another city, a man who once called me Dad was learning what happens when you mistake a father's mercy for weakness.